Yes, as you give an introduction, you are. This is my honor. It's my great duty to present to the Patreon feed Frank Yang, who is. I never really know how to explain what you do to people who when I'm like mentioning you. So how would you? What would you explain? What do you do? What do you tell people if they ask you that?
Recently I've been telling people I'm a vlogger that vlogs about consciousness.
Consciousness blogger.
Yeah, or like people are like I vlog about my life, and then I guess for me it's more like I vlog about the life of my
You
mind.
mad? You mad, bro? You mad at a hologram, bro?
Isn't everyone kind of doing that, even if they don't realize they are? I mean, everyone's blogging about the contents of their consciousness, but you're getting kind of meta about it. You sort of
Yes,
what?
yes. Everyone is actually just vlogging about their consciousness from that perspective. Yes, even like any kind of film, any film that you watch is about it's about the mind. Even if you watch like The Dark Knight, if you watch the dumbest like superhero movies that doesn't delve into like the psychology of the heroes, it's still from one perspective, it's still just the whole movie is still a mind. And
Yeah, I think it's got to be for any of the story to feel meaningful or relative. It's got to be about some sort of transformation of the self, or
right,
like that's kind of like what a character arc is. It's
right.
normally sort of like exploring with a story, like the kinds of the kind of transformations that a person can go through, maybe, or
Yeah, so
I mean
that's all.
that's what makes it juicy.
Yeah, so that's all. Yeah, that's the mental calm. But then there are movies where like there's that
the men,
the mental
that's the
calm.
mental cut.
That's the mental calm. But then there are movies where they explicitly within their narrative structure, which is already mental calm, they add another layer of extra creamy mental calm that focuses on the mind. So the movies that are like that are like Being John Malkovich or like what's another one? Inception kind of.
Flubber, flubber.
Club, I haven't seen that one.
I
Uh,
thought even like what some of the recent Marvel movies
yeah,
have,
yeah.
like you really get the feeling that half the art team are like trying to communicate psychedelic experiences. Like, have
True.
you seen
Yes.
Doctor Strange? Like the one
Yes.
with Benedict Cumberbatch? There's all these scenes where you're just like, I wonder where this came from.
Have you seen the new Spider-Man movie, the Spider-Man animation?
Yeah. Oh, I loved it.
Yeah, I loved
It
it.
was
That
really
one,
good.
yeah, love that one. I can talk
Yeah.
about that one for a while because I like that one because it's like the whole thing is like a DMT trip, not just like that one part. Like the whole structure is based on like infinity, multiverse, and like the fact that there's so many
Yeah.
Spider-Mans, but the essence is sort of the same, but the forms are different, and just the way
And
they.
it's kind of fun that it's about to become Spider-Man. He's like has to discover his specific way of being, part of a sort of infinite set of Spider-Mans. He has to kind of figure out, like all the funny jokes about his origin story and then what his specific powers were. It reminded me of like sort of like self-actualizing. Like you imagine there's kind of a multiverse with the sort of infinite versions of you, and the task in your life is to kind of figure out how to be this authentic, like realized version of yourself. Like that was kind of what I got from it. Maybe I was reaching, but that was kind of how I felt. Like he has to go through this kind of process to become a Spider-Man. But it's just one iteration of an infinite set of Spider-Mans. It made me feel like um, part of it also felt like I could really feel um, like it reminded me of what it's like trying to become an artist, because like to really make the sort of like powerful, I don't feel like you really decide what artwork is going to come out of you ultimately. Like you just figure out, based on whatever the structure of your brain or whatever's happened in your life, you just kind of figure out how to. I really do feel like there's just something that you discover, or that happens to you. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, so the way I look at it is like ultimately, even though there's so many versions of Spider-Man, there's only one Spider-Man at the end, and then all the other Spider-Mans are just like different manifestation and different like relative versions of the same kind of ideal. So there's only one Spider-Man, even in the Spider-Man where there's like 20 Spider-Man. So maybe like for art, you do all those different drawings of different characters and different styles, and maybe at the end of the day, they're all just Miles. They can look nothing like Miles, but they're still
Yeah.
Miles. But what is Miles though?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know because when I say self-actualize, I'm not even really sure if I believe that that concept means anything. Because when you sort of start trying to look for an authentic self, that's kind of like what are you? That's a tricky one. Um, I guess what I mean when I say in artwork, like when I think about like my aesthetic taste and sort of you spend years and years like having to sort of learn
Mm-hmm.
drawing or painting or filmmaking or cooking or dance or something. Like you gotta sort of go through a disciplinary phase to actually be able to like express anything. But then I sometimes feel like the choices I make aesthetically and the kind of subjects I'll do are probably shaped by just events that have shaped my brain that are kind of arbitrary. Like where you were born, maybe like some random moment in your childhood that has like I'm obsessed with always putting rain into images and the feel like raindrops and I wonder if it just goes back to like some good I grew up in like just a very rainy country and there's just some memory of like I have a couple of early memories of just being in like heavy showers and just loving that. And I don't know if that makes it like the essential self or if it's just kind of you just get these things just imprint on you early or something. Do you get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, yeah. I think if you try to look through to your essential self through that process, I think that the blank piece of paper or the screen of the movie before any movie is being projected on it is the essential self. And then you go through life, and then another word for that blank screen or for that blank paper is consciousness, right? And then like you go through life with this blank piece of like canvas or screen, and you suck in or like all the experiences you have, all the books you read, all the artwork you see gets imprinted on there as a mind. So what the mind is the limitation of what mind is what consciousness is when it's limited by concepts or form, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
It's
like
like the specific vessel that it's in right now, that because otherwise it would just be totally infinite and formless.
right. And the funny thing is, a lot of artists, I've been looking into a lot of artists that just sort of stop creating. I feel like some artists stop creating because they found themselves through the creation of art. Because like Leo from actualize.org actually said like art is actually a type of pseudo spirituality. It's spirituality, the process and the structure of creativity is very much like spirituality in that sense, and you just keep trying to find yourself. No matter what you draw, what you paint, what you film, it's always going back to how am I going to find myself? And then some artists break through that and be like, okay, I found myself. I'm the blank slate. I'm the screen behind the movie. I'm just this paper, and then they just stop sort of creating, or they got addicted to drugs. There's different reasons, but some artists just transcended that whole thing. So that the part of them being so self-destructive and die, another part where you actually peacefully found yourself. They're kind of polar opposite, but the same. For me to find myself as an artist, I kind of have to die.
Yeah, I do sometimes feel like I've been talking about this a bit recently that so much of the strong drive that sort of put me on the path to wanting to create stuff does come from a fundamental like insecurity, because there's a strong impulse to not just like validation from other people, but it's like constantly. Sometimes like the thing that drives me to want to create stuff is this sense that it's like a little bit neurotic. Like I have trouble just being okay with life as it is. Do you know what I mean? Like there's often this feeling that I'm trying to make something that will do something or will express something or that will show myself that the world is like beautiful and aesthetic and worth being in. And that's obviously like, yeah, ultimately if you found that, you found that in it, I think of it, you might reach a point where you realize that's kind of a sort of hopeless path. You're never going to make the painting that you sort of look at and you've escaped the cycle of life and suffering.
Right.
So I do, or even like I've tried so hard for so long to do something is because um, there was always there was a sense in me that I wanted to do something more with life, and again that comes down to maybe an actual inability to just be fully present. But at the same time, yeah, I don't feel like, I mean, who knows, I don't feel like reaching any kind of attainment would have to be the end of creating art. Like you said, you could reach a point where you just sort of, you do it because it's something you do.
Yeah.
It's just in your nature to be creative.
No matter what kind of a person you are going down that path, you still have a personality, you still have your own temperament and talent. So a person, I say a person who is always is into painting, he's more likely to like attain some sort of realization and continue to paint, but in a sort of under a different context a little bit. And there's another kind where the artist isn't really always like being an artist isn't in his genetics, so maybe he used that as a medium, as a jumping stone, to as a ladder to self-actualize more. And that person's genetic or innate drive isn't art, and that sort of at the end of his realization, he might quit art and just because everything he perceives is like creating itself through itself, like on a moment-to-moment basis. That's what Osho is. Osho just sort of look at art as like a second-tier spirituality, and then he feels like, for him, his direct experience, everything that he's looking at, it is in the process of him being a co-creator with God, and every moment he's kind of creating, and he doesn't feel the need to really need to like express that in form.
Like if you're looking at a beautiful sunset or something, there is a sense in that experience of how it looks is being created by your own consciousness. Like you're painting it with your consciousness in the moment. Like as you're looking at the world, that visual aspect of the experience, I can get that is being created in real time. Let's say you want to like draw the way some leaves are scattered on the ground in a painting. It's very hard as a person to design that in a way that doesn't feel totally contrived and look very human-made. All the leaves in equal groups, equally spaced apart. So you start trying to recreate some of this. It seems more aesthetic if you can recreate that kind of dynamic imbalance that you get in nature. And then when you start looking for it everywhere, you start seeing that sort of every aspect of the visual world is just effortlessly perfect in its aesthetics. Like even if you're in a room and there's like scratches on the floor from just like how people move in and out of the room and how furniture is been around, they're always laid out like a beautiful abstract painting. Like the sort of composition of what just the unfolding of the universe is often mind blowing. You look at some clouds, right? And it's never a mess. It's not symmetrical. It's not ordered. But there's always this kind of like perfect rhythms between the shapes of the cloud, like the little spaces of tight detailing, and then the big open spaces. It's just like the compositional skills of nature on its own. I mean, in some sense, when you study composition in painting, you must just be learning how to reflect how natural systems look, which for whatever reason we seem to have an innate appreciation for.
Yeah.
And then, like a style is almost like the little flavor you add. I'm not sure if any of that made sense. I feel like it made some sense. It's hard to talk about.
I think it makes sense because that reminds me of like ultra realism paintings.
Like hyper-realism.
Hyper-realism painting where people just paint the most mundane object and it looks like a snapshot. It's not like they're even trying to like compose anything. They're just painting something that's there, but make it so realistically, like the simulation almost becomes the real. And then that kind of shows you that like you said, everything in nature is like unfolding perfectly, and then like all you have to do is ride that wave as close as you can to its original source, and that would be beautiful. Another example is like spiders or like insects or like grotesque objects like corpses. When you look at it in real life, your experience of it is filtered by your conception of death and decay and the smell of it. In real life, would fuck with your mind and thinking that that's not beautiful, right? And then,
Yeah.
but if you look at a lot of like hyper-realism paintings, like people that paint disgusting objects, really, really realistically and really aesthetically,
Yeah, if you can get underneath,
underneath the
but yeah,
structure.
there is a kind of moral ambiguity. Like if you can get beneath that layer of, like you said, thinking and reacting to what's going on, that aesthetic is always present.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
sometimes feel like that's what horror movies or like the whole horror genre is about, exploring the aesthetic side of horrible things in life from a sort of safe
Right.
perspective.
It's the same. It's the
Like you,
same. Yeah.
like it shows you that if you can remove the sort of, if you can lower the fear level, we want to, like, there's something in consciousness that finds the grotesque and the horrifying still beautiful. If you can get to a more detached perspective, and when you're watching a movie, it's a little bit like having a really high level of equanimity. It's easy to understand in the abstract
Yeah.
why having like great equanimity might be good.
Yeah.
But it's like very easy to come up with thousands of real world examples where you would just recoil in horror at the idea of, like the kinds of experiences that people go through in life. Like we're so attached, and the sort of the reality of suffering as well. Like often I feel like I'm willing to take it on me to try and have greater equanimity towards my own suffering, but I think it starts to feel very evil if you imagine being totally okay with inflicting suffering on others, because you just feel like ultimately, it's all beautiful. Like you could almost like you start to go down the path where someone like Jeffrey Dahmer is like a weird performance artist. It's like I feel very unwilling to let go of, like, somehow part of me wants it to be like, wants a kind of moral absolutism that it's just like not. It's really not okay to sort of inflict suffering on others. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, because that's the program of your mind that says there is something that is objectively moral, and then using that lens to see that experience.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah.
understand what you're saying, but I think like
It's Part of me realizes that there's a big part of my ego that's attracted to the idea of equanimity, because part of me wants to be able to not suffer.
right,
Like there's like I'll hear a lecture on, like you'll be in a good mood where your body feels good, you're not in any pain, you feel alert, awake, you feel comfortable, and those ideas make a lot of sense. And then like you'll get like food poisoning or something, and like you realize that there's part of you that is trying to use mindfulness to not suffer anymore, and it's just never gonna, or to not feel pain anymore, and that's never gonna be an option. Do you know what I mean? Like I feel like you can become very non-reactive and try to just kind of have space to sort of tolerate.
there's a difference between like pain and suffering, I think, because we're kind of using
Yeah,
those two words interchangeably, but like I think pain is just the physical sensation of your body getting inflicted by a force outside of yourself that creates this experience. But suffering is the conceptual and the linguistic, or the programs, the matrix that you attach to that experience, that pure raw experience of pain.
yeah.
So
It's
that's
the
suffering.
fear that it's the fear about the implications of the pain,
Right.
or that it's going to go on forever. It's clear to me that it is possible to have some kind of equanimity in the face of the most unbelievable pain. You look at like self-immolating monks,
Yeah,
who
yeah,
set
yeah.
themselves on fire, or
Hmm.
like monks. Like, have you seen that self-mummification thing, where they stay on like there's some name for this process where they eat like a special diet.
Hmm.
basically like bark or something. Like you're like drying yourself out until they get so weak that they will sit and basically die, and then the body will mummify. Like they sit in a little box, so they sort of like self-mummify. And I feel like these are people who are trying to sort of prove their own commitment to the idea of being, truly being, having equanimity in the face of suffering. And that is such a like challenging thing to look at from the outside. Because I think I don't know, like what is your average person's conception of what life is meant? I feel like mine was like, you try to experience like a reasonable amount of pleasure for as long as feasibly possible. And yeah, if you ask most people like what is life about, I think it is impossible to avoid suffering. It's impossible to avoid dying. It's impossible to avoid the reality of maybe pain, not suffering. So there's something about some people who just say, well, there's nothing for me to do here in this life. I'm just gonna self-mummify. That is so like hard to wrap your head around. It's been nearly a year now of pretty much every day meditating daily, but still it barely adds up to like the time you'd spend on one silent retreat. But it's been enough that I've, like definitely, started to notice things, started to have more awareness about what it's actually like to be me from the inside. And one of the ways I often explain arising and passing is just, it feels like everything arrives in a wave. Things build and then they subside. They usually peak at some point. But then even like just, like you said, you can feel it with your sort of energy level as the days roll by. Everything is kind of in rhythm. That you can feel the rhythms of your body moving in time with the spinning of this planet. As you wake up in the morning and you sort of reach peak moments of alertness at several points throughout the day, and then it happens in a conversation, when you sort of reach that flow where it's flowing really easily, and then it becomes awkward as you're sort of. But yeah, as you said, I guess like training your awareness with mindfulness meditation is getting better at spotting smaller and smaller things. Because every now and then, when I am really focused in meditation, I'll notice, like you said, like a thought sort of flash into the mind out of nowhere, and then there'll be have some reaction to the thought, and you can kind of just watch it all happen. But a lot of the times it's hard to hold your attention, and you sort of don't really notice things have happened until maybe in retrospect.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think it really changes the way you feel about what you're doing in the world, because I mean, so much of what everyone is doing is essentially just coming up with really convoluted ways to get high, right?
Yeah.
So like like you're sort of trying to build when someone is trying to like build or chase a career, like normally the reason they're doing it is for these little moments of dopamine rushes when things in the world kind of signal that you're making progress towards your goals, or perhaps like the reason we do things in the world is for how they're gonna feel in our body. Like you're sort of trying to get high on
mental.
It's like getting high on your own brain chemistry. And then obviously some people, like it's clear that just chasing getting high is very destructive, because when you sort of follow to its extreme, that's like getting into a serious heroin problem or something. Like eventually it never ends. Like the wanting for more pleasure is never satisfied by achieving more pleasure. So I've kind of enjoyed meditation as this kind of it's just this other, like how transformative it can be to just sit still and watch what your mind does can sort of naturally solve so many of the things that you think are a problem in your life. But it's like mindfulness is kind of easy and fun when it's like learning how to lessen your social anxiety or learning how to do something like that. But I think it still becomes very challenging, like you said, when you reach that level of like trying to have true equanimity in the face of suffering, or like what should I actually do is there anything I'm supposed to do with my life, with this time I have existing? Do you know what I mean? Or maybe the structure of asking that question
That's just another
is
phenomenon that's gonna rise
that,
and pass.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that's why, and that's where so much of suffering comes from, is because I think we have evolution has built a mind that is always looking for the next task, because there are obvious survival benefits to that. Like always, like to just be wired to always be anxious that you've forgotten to do something or that you haven't anticipated something,
Right.
is clearly something that would be selected for by a process like natural selection, where staying alive is the goal.
Yeah.
But when you step back from that and you just really get to like, I guess that's that kind of deeper peace you can get to, is realizing that you actually don't have to do so much. And then, yeah, I mean, is it more just kind of a play, like you can become a bit more playful with life, like you said, things are happening, you have an experience, so it's clear that just lying in bed doesn't really get it. Like doing nothing seems a bit pointless. I'm, I've never felt sort of suicidal. Luckily, I've never had that. That's just never been something that's arisen in my life. But I just kind of enjoy getting lost in the dream, to be honest. Like this past couple of weeks for me has just been. I've just been in I love having a goal. Like I'm just going to produce a bunch of paintings, and I'm going to sort of explore that side of myself. And part of me is just okay with like. I find my experience of the world much more pleasant when I don't try to question what that's for ultimately. When I've just found something that is working right now. But I guess there's some deeper anxiety that it's just another temporary blip until the next kind of
Yeah.
time you're thrown out of that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think like you have to be like totally like involved with what you're doing, but totally detached at the same time. Like if you can find that balance of that paradox, then you can live a pretty good life. That's why some
Yeah.
people like are like, why don't you just go into the mountain and like meditate and stuff? You talk about this stuff so much, but then at the same time, like that's just one side of the coin. You have a self that you have to develop, but then if you don't have you don't have a healthy developed ego, you're not gonna have the strength of the awareness to like house that ego. So you have no ego, and they're just the monks. Since they're like born, they just go into the monastery. They don't have a sense. They don't even have a healthy sense of self to begin with. So there's no work that needs to be done to tame that ego. So you're kind of just like just patterning on one side of the extreme while ignoring the other. And a more practical example is people who um, they do meditation, but then they also look at life and all the struggles of life as part of that meditation. So you kind of like Leo's videos. He's talking about the enlightenment work and self-development. And a lot of the times he feels like a lot of his students feels like there's a conflict. Okay, you want us to self-develop, which is mostly like 90% like ego shit. And then you want us to find enlightenment, which is the death of the self. Like which one should I go for? And then I think the solution is always just to find balance and just to do both without the goal of neither, without the goal of I have to be enlightened or I have to be a great artist. They can gel into one as long as you just enjoy the process. Because you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and trying to destroy the ego is a very egoic goal, because the reason to do it is this desire to be better or to stop suffering.
Yeah, yeah,
Like it still shows that you fundamentally don't you haven't seen the kind of selflessness of consciousness, because you really feel like there's something to get rid of. So part of me feels like it can just be, or maybe this is wishful thinking, but I feel like it's like if you don't like if you don't find your life is full of unnecessary suffering and things are just flowing around you nicely, and you're enjoying like you said, that you have this thing that we ego, like you have a mind that has
yeah.
been shaped by the world, and
I,
yeah, I don't know.
I think that
It's,
the process is never just linear or this and that. So like I always use the example of like Beethoven or like really like egoistic artists like Picasso or even like Michael Jordan, I think they're so great because in certain situations, they're completely in their ego and they're so unaware that they have an ego. That's almost like a flow state right there. Because having like 100% ego is almost like the same as having 100% no ego. Because during that state, they're connected to the source. So like for those artists or for those athletes, it's a process of not just recognizing that, but like you sort of you know how maybe you ride your bike up a mountain, right? And then you have to try really hard to paddle the bike, and then you go through up a hill, you go up a hill, and then you see a downhill, and you just relax, and you go over and over again, right? So like I think the flow state or the training of an athlete or artist is kind of like that. It's like I always say like you start your project through the ego. Even in meditation, you start the process of transcendence through the ego. The ego is what's making you want to sit down and meditate and to get rid of the ego. And then you get to a point where you see through the ego's illusion, and then you get to turn it on and off and be like, okay, at this point, I'm just gonna surrender my ego and go with the flow. But then you come back to it and you work on some of it more from the egoic perspective. Like when Beethoven's composing music, there's no way that he can make the kind of music he does. There's no way that we can feel that sort of that feeling of transcendence when his entire song was just purely ego based. Which is why I don't really like rap. There was some rap are pretty flow, but like using an example of classical musicians, like a lot of them like are like fucked up in life. They're alcoholics and stuff. So the will to compose. So they start the piece through the ego, and then they let the truth take over, and then it's like this wave thing that that is, again, it's like the rising and passing, contracting expansion. You contract your ego and you expand, you contract, you expand. But if you just stuck with one way, your work is never going to be as effective through either side.
Yeah, I mean, it can be like I think a part of it is that so much of making art or doing any of these things requires so much effort that the ego can be used as a kind of engine to make change, because it's kind of like you said, like if you were just truly blissed out at peace, you just wait to do anything, you're not going to go through all that trouble. I sometimes feel when making art that it is a kind of confidence is such a necessary component that, like you said, you need this kind of force to get you started, to get you moving, to get. Sometimes I'll just be in the middle of a day where, like the other week, I really had this goal. I had to start this painting like that day, and so it's like you got to all the just regular shit of life, like cooking meals, whatever, like working out, and then you sit down, you got to sketch an idea, and you got to measure the thing, got to narrow the shot by the bars, come back, stretch the canvas, start the painting, and like in the middle of all of this, I'll just be thinking like, this is like such a huge amount of effort to be putting into something that I couldn't ultimately explain why I even need to do it.
So what the process that you were describing is what I call co-creating, I guess, because you always, in this dance with the cosmic force, like the force that makes the bird chirp, and the force that makes up the dog and makes up like the Katy Perry's like dog, whatever. This is the same like force fundamentally.
Yeah.
Then the my egoic force of trying to capture that, or my egoic force of trying to like fuck a girl, like from like the broad God perspective. When I say God, I just kind of mean Spinoza's God, like just nature, just like infinity. It's not like a person sitting in the cloud.
Yeah, you could almost use the word multiverse in its place or something.
Yeah.
Everything.
There's everything.
Reality with capital R.
Yeah, exactly. And that's and from that
The Tao.
Right, the doubt, yeah. So from that perspective, your job as an artist is sort of always like riding, like you say, riding the wave. Like you don't want to be in the way too much of the wave, but you can't just not see the wave at all if you just lay on your bed and not ride the wave. But then at the same time, just me sitting by in a chair or like in a cave for 30 years, that's my way of riding the wave, which could be true. That's how some of those monks are. That's what they do. And then they can choose to contribute, they can choose to have students over, or they can just sit on the diapers all day. And either way, it's still part of the wave.
Yeah.
Yeah, which brings me back to the concept of the ego again. Like after talking about ego, and then like I'm sure a lot of viewers will have this almost negative. Like most people have a negative like connotation to the ego, but at the same time, what is the ego but just another thought? You know, the ego is not like something solid that's sitting in your head that's like dictating your move, and then just trying to get everything to feed itself. Because the ego, when you see through and we deconstruct its solidity is just another thought that's no different from any other thought. Yeah, so the same force that's giving birth to the universe, the thought is part of that energy anyway. So like even if you look at like someone like Rich Piana, who's like super egoic, the way that I look at him now, like it's hard for me to see an ego. I mean, like yeah, relatively speaking, I can see yeah that guy has a big ego, but at the same time, there's another layer of perception around that, and says, well, that's just God playing its own game. You know, there's nothing.
I think a big part of it is that we have a hard time getting behind how intense our sort of programmed judgment of each other is.
Yeah, the program.
There's a great Ramdas thing about like he talks about seeing people like trees. Like a lot of it in Buddhism they describe as just seeing. Like a lot of compassion is just clearly seeing that the web of cause and effect that leads to things being the way they are.
Yeah, right.
Like if you're walking through a forest, right, and some of the trees are huge and blooming, they have good soil nutrients, they're in the sun, and then there are other ones that are kind of withered or crooked. You don't judge them as a bad tree. You just kind of understand that the way this is unfolded, there is a reason that this tree looks the way it does. It could have been damaged in a storm, could have been hit by a parasite, and that people are kind of essentially the same.
Right.
And our nutrients might be sort of social love, stable environment.
Right.
You know, like healthy functioning. Like maybe as we understand more about what causes psychopathy and other antisocial personality types, it'll become clear that. Like true compassion to me, like compassion is just clearly seeing cause and effect and removing judgment.
Right.
Because then that really does remove like your hatred of other people. Like you start to realize that if I was them, I would be them.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
that simple. There's no essential thing in you that gives you the right to claim ownership for your good qualities.
Because
and it's equally rational to sort of condemn the bad in other people. And that to me is like that's the kind of peak moments of compassion in my life. It's been as simple as clearly seeing either actually seeing what it is that has made someone the way they are, or just understanding that not knowing it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Like so many people will see someone and just be like, you know, fuck that person.
Right.
But if you could go back and see the childhood they had, or you know, it might go back to pre-birth. There might be like events that can happen to a developing brain in the womb, or just however you want to put it. Like compassion is just seeing the cause and effect and just accepting it. Like your judgment is a kind of childish wishing the world wasn't the way it was, and it's like trying to fight the tide or something. You know, you can't like. And that I suppose that is the essence of equanimity. It's just understanding that things are the way they are for incredibly like so much suffering comes from just wishing the world wasn't the way it was. But even there is a kind of perfection to the universe. Like to me, it's like the archetypical heaven and archetypical hell just blend them together, and that's what the universe is. Like when you say perfection. There's a perfection in its utter completeness. It's just total everything.
Yeah,
it's all good and all bad. You know, it's all suffering and all overcoming of suffering.
Yeah.
But it is so hard not to habitually judge. You know, because like someone, just that in some sense that's what suffering is. You know, it's the kind of judging the present moment, wishing it wasn't the way it was, wishing we had some. You know, it's like the three poisons in Buddhism of like denial. Like desiring and ignorance.
Yeah.
You're either sort of denying the way the world is, but that just is what it is.
Yeah.
You're denying the way the moment is, or you're wishing you were in a moment that you have judged as better, or you're ignoring the specific qualities of the moment you're in. And those are the kind of three flavors of suffering. I've wanted to make some artwork, like I'd love to find a clever way to illustrate, maybe each of the three poisons individually. But I find that if I have an idea like that, it's actually very hard to consciously choose to make art about something. It always makes it a little bit awkward.
Yeah, I understand that. Every time I have an idea, then I make the art is never as good as when I just make it and then be like, oh, that was what I was trying to communicate. Because then then you're not as much as riding the wave that's throwing at you at this particular time of life, but you already had a concept in your ego and then you want to manifest that. And when that happens, you sort of block out the things that are flowing there. That's why like synchronicity doesn't happen as much when you're coming from the more egoistic state. And like you said, like the judgment, it's always the way that the world isn't appear to your own mind, which is completely selfish, kind of, because like the reality is so much bigger than you, and you just gotta sort of be humble and accept the fact that the reality, the intelligence of reality is infinity times like smarter and knows what it's doing than your own little intellect, because the intellect, it's so small. Even the human heart, it's so small compared to like the infinity of the universe,
Yeah. I often, like you were saying, riding the wave. Like to me, like my best art has come out of following intuitive impulses, because if you chase what intuition is, your brain is a system incapable of randomness or arbitrary decisions. So I use my kind of, I've developed, I think you can develop a sense of just, I don't know what you want to call it. Just it's like there's this sense for something. I sometimes tell people I'll sit down to sketch with no idea of what I'm going to do, and certain ideas will, there's nothing wrong with them, but I'm not. There's nothing there, and then the work, the doodles or the sketches that sort of shine out of the page. There's just something about it that I couldn't tell you. And then I go there and I'll sort of sculpt and play with that idea. And every time I find an addition that just, it's like, you're riding the wave. You just get this feeling like, yep, that's right. And then in hindsight, people will ask what a work is about. And you might be able to kind of come up with a sort of story. But the story is it is literally just a story, because there were all these individual moments of consciousness where even in the moment, I didn't know why I was picking the choices I was picking. They just felt, you're just vibing with the piece. And to me, like that work is always the stuff that ends up with a certain kind of power to it, because the complex cause and effect of your intuition, why certain things will appeal to you and others won't, why something seems interesting and something else doesn't, that's a much richer, web of thinking than your sort of conscious narrative of saying like, oh, I want to make a work about the three poisons. That's like very surface level. And when you start following your intuition, it's like you're accessing this kind of, you think of the deep constellations of neurons in your brain firing and the things that manifest in your dreams, that kind of creativity that's just innately in you. And so I feel like, the first phase of an artist, if you want to make art, is like you just got to just like train to express, because a lot of bad art is like just not being able to realize it. You just can't realize a vision. You're awkward. You don't know how to. Like I often downplay that when I'm talking, because it sounds like you're trying to big yourself up. But like it is so hard to make art, and it is so hard to get good enough to do it. Like there's just so many really complicated moments of solving elements of a picture that are just like very difficult little puzzles and challenges for you to overcome. But it all has to be driven by a kind of deeper vision. But that, for me, it's driven by like, it's like I've been doing some workshops where I try to teach composition, like trying to teach people how to make work. Like I can't tell them what to make work about, because then it wouldn't, if it's something I want to make work about, then it's my work to make. But trying to teach them how to think about, trying to teach them to recognize or habits or thinking techniques to sort of tap into your own intuition, tap into your own sort of creative power. Because just by having a brain, you have this kind of powerful innate creativity, the way I think about it.
I think like what you're saying, like I can in my head I was formulating like this metaphor, like a physical metaphor. Let's just say the brain. Like just say I play the violin, and you said that a lot of artists can't even have the fundamental skills to express themselves. So which the first part of it is that you have to take the basic drawing classes. You have to have this phase of your training. And in the Renaissance artists, they have to go to the studios of like masters to like really hone the skills. That's why Raphael and
Yeah.
like Picasso, they could really draw. Picasso could draw technically as good as Raphael even before Raphael could do that. But so there goes a few stages. So for me personally, I think the violin, like the first part of learning a piece is you're activating your intellect, your imagination, basically your quote unquote brain, and you're trying to like manipulate symbols in your brain, almost like math. It's very like intellectual, very like logical, very rational. But then that's not the end of the game. The next step is to sort of let that knowledge, once you perfected it, like we said, and then let it seep into like your, let's say your heart. Now you can feel whatever your intellect was creating. You can merge like the feeling, like the extra calm, the extra like hard calm that covers the intellectual like rigid machine. And then there's a third step where that it seeps into your limbic system. So, well, if you want to use the metaphor of the brain, is the cortex, the cerebral cortex, and the limbic system. That's the heart. And then you, after that, you take those two elements, you combine it, and you let it sink or seep into the third part, which is your limbic system. And by the time all those skills of your heart, your emotions, how your emotion affects the intellect, goes through your limbic system, that's where the good stuff comes. And that's when you can really go into a flow state. Because for people that go into a flow state, they're just kind of unconscious. So they're just kind of letting their limbic system, the motor skills, do the work. But you can't do that unless you have the previous two phases like buckled down, you know?
Yeah,
And
exactly, because it takes you need technique to be something that doesn't occupy every if technique and trying to execute things occupies all of your attention, there's no room for a flow state to happen. You're sort of only and like you kind of reach this point where every decision you're trying to make is held back by worrying about whether you can you pull it off, can you do it. There almost has to be a confidence that you can do anything, and then you're able to explore. Yeah, like what should I do? What am I feeling, or what am I trying to express here? And but like if you're listening to this and you want to be an artist, like you have to practice so much more than you can rationally justify. Like you can't sort of think of it from like I think too many people. It's like if you want to make world-class art, you have to approach this the way you imagine like an athlete or anyone else would do it. It has to be an obsession.
So even the process of achieving that quote unquote enlightenment, first you have to fill your heads. First you have to understand intellectually what non-duality is. You have to understand intellectually. You have to read a lot of books about spirituality to even begin to have any kind of ground. And then once your mind and your intellect understand from the conceptual level what it is that you're trying to strive, that's not enough. Then you have to let it seep down to your heart. And then that's when like the next phase is applying compassion and applying empathy to like your knowledge about non-duality in the head. And then you let it seep down deeper into your roots, like your balls or whatever. And then like that's when they say that if you want to be quote unquote like completely or fully enlightened, it has to seep down into the cellular level. They use that word a lot. That every single cell of your body has to be like infused with non-duality, not just your head. Like there's some teachers who are like intellectually enlightened. They can talk and speak and convince people that they're enlightened. But then they're not embodied that non-duality into like every little action in their life, and that process is it's a long process to be able to like from the intellectual side to your heart showing compassion, and then seeping down to every single like cell in your body, including your toes. So like every step that you take is
Don't forget the
infused.
toes.
Don't forget the toes, the pinkies. Every like if you see those masters though, like every step that they take, they're like walking on clouds. You know, you can't like versus those intellectuals who like just sit in there like Stephen Hawkins, they're just like completely stiff, and everything's coming from their intellect. You see a huge difference between the way they're being in the world. So in talking about
I've never met anyone of any sort of convincing attainment in any kind of spiritual dimension. It's like an experience that I've never had.
I haven't really.
And
I met like Xi
I've
Young, who's like my favorite teacher, but not enough time to really like feel his energy in a sense. But like I kind of understand like why so many people when they like be around enlightened people, they feel so like in peace and stuff like that. Versus teachers who are mostly in the head.
Could you try and explain to someone who is listening to this from a totally not into any consciousness work, like how you would describe non-duality?
The way I would describe non-duality is let me just use a few like keywords to sort of replace the word non-duality that people might have a different connotation of it. Number one
Or
is
you could maybe start by, we could also explain like what the sort of common, most people walk around with a conception of what you might call duality, and explain what that is as well.
okay. Duality is just black and white. Like you see things through either this or that. Okay, this is the word is either evil or it's good. God is by definition evil. Oh no, sorry. God is by definition good. So let's attribute on paper every term that's associated with good, like beauty, creativity, um, omniscience, to God, and then other words like oh, evil and the devil or like death, you just automatically from the dualistic perspective, because like the mind is by default a dualistic machine. So you make the separation within like the conceptual scheme of your mind. So your mind is in little boxes. Every time you have a box, there's another box that's gonna counter that box. Every time you have an idea, there's another idea that's gonna counter that idea. That's when you're living in duality and using your mind to perceive the world. Yeah.
It could also be called opposites.
Opposites.
You know, like self and world is
Right.
a classic one is mind and body.
Right,
Like
right.
a lot of people walk around with a kind of intuitive sense that there is an inside,
Mind.
there is an inside of your experience, and
an
then there is
outside.
this outside thing,
Right.
the world.
Yeah.
Or
So somebody who's experienced non-duality would look at the word God, or when somebody mentioned God, he will automatically sort of understand that God is infinite, because infinity is pretty much non-duality, because like infinity is everything and there's no opposite to everything. The absolute has no opposite. So the other word is absolute. If something is absolute, it includes everything that can ever be imagined, including things that can't even be imagined, or else by its own definition wouldn't be called the absolute. But within the absolute, here's a tricky part about non-duality though. Like within the absolute or within the non-duality, there is still duality, there's still the relatives, because the infinity or the absolute includes everything. If it includes everything, it must also include dualities and relatives. But you can't. It's hard to understand that unless you step out of duality and then come back to it to realize that non-duality includes dualities and the absolute includes all relatives. So
I sometimes think, like, one thing that illustrated the concept a bit to me is to think that a lot of opposites are a construction of language, right? So a classic one of think of like the room. If you're inside right now, if you're in a room, think of the conception of being inside of this room and then outside. So with language, you think of these two words as representing different properties, right? Inside and outside. But it wouldn't make sense to say you're inside of something. You need the entire rest of the outside for the inside to make sense. Like in some sense, inside and outside are the same,
right.
different ends of the same system. Like hot and cold, like temperature. There's no point where it just becomes hot, and then and everything from here downwards is cold. Like there's just temperature, and
Right.
there's a kind of spectrum of yeah, like cold and heat obviously have very different um, properties, but really there's just temperature. Temperature would be the absolute conception, and
Right,
then hot and cold are these two sort of words that divide up,
right.
that
Totally,
divide up, or
totally
light and
understand.
dark. You know, light in some sense, light and dark aren't actually two separate things. Um, there's just light and its absence, and you
Yeah.
can kind of only see, a shadow is just an area where light isn't, or a lower area of light. So there's this kind of sense that a lot of times whenever we build a duality out of language, there's really only one. There's just one. There's light dark.
That's why they say you can't be described, you can't be put into words. They're just finger words and concepts such as fingers pointing to the moon. The moon is
Yeah.
non-duality, and then but then you have to realize, oh, I see the moon. That's non-duality. So that's not the moon. Is that not non-duality? No. When you see the moon, you realize when you really understand non-duality, you realize everything is the moon. But then you try to talk about the moon, you just like most people talk about non-duality, they're just fingers like fighting each other. But that's what's preventing them from seeing the moon. That's everywhere.
Another way I've described it, a way of deconstructing self and other, is if you're watching waves in the sea, like waves in the ocean, you can follow a wave and you can point to it, and we use this noun to sort of this temporary phenomena. The wave arises and then breaks, but you can kind of point at it and say that right there, that's the wave. But if you sort of try to go in and talk about what are we actually talking about here, it's a pattern of behavior, and at any given time, the sort of particles that make up the wave are changing, and there's no actual clear boundary where the wave ends and the rest of the ocean begins. So there's this kind of like that would be like it's realizing that so often the function of even just nouns in language is to create these kind of divisions in the
Right,
world,
right.
when really there is just one, like the whole of the universe, the
This is
whole
one
thing
substance.
unfolding is the ocean.
Yeah.
And language has this continual habit of trying to point at temporary patterns of behavior that we call nouns. Even yourself, you are just like this kind of wave emerging into time, this kind of temporary pattern that will then disperse back into all of being. That's what happens upon death. Is a pattern ceases. The sort of anti-entropic homeostasis of your body fails, and you just kind of dissolve back into everything. And so I often think of it that like it really is it's something that language has done to human consciousness. Like language has given us huge amounts of power as an animal. We obviously have way more ability to sort of control and manipulate our environment through our sort of language capabilities. But the sort of side effect is there's this kind of continual suffering, because we confuse the language with reality. In some essence, like attachment is when we're attached to a thing. We're attaching to some temporary. Everything is a temporary manifestation, and we find one that we like, and we say, I want this one to last forever. And the process of becoming non-attached is just kind of realizing the absurdity of doing that. And you're just continuously, you get the choice between tricking yourself for the rest of your life over and over again, just continuously trying to find permanence in things that are by definition impermanent.
Yeah. So
Or you can, or yeah, so sort of,
it,
yeah, or you can just kind of become aware of the flowing of time, like you said, of just the flowing of phenomena.
Yeah.
And that's a kind of,
the way I like to describe going back to what you said about nouns, like I made like a few videos about how like a human, there's nothing like all the sufferings in the world are caused by perceiving things as static when everything is like impermanent. And then I made this whole post in a video saying how like there's no like chair, there's only sharing, there's only verbs, no nouns
yeah,
in the universe.
exactly.
There's no,
Yeah, how weird a more correct language would sound.
Yeah.
You would everything would have to be a verb.
Yeah. Or there's no
It's
miles.
like, right.
There's no miles. There's only miling. There's no
Miles and
franking. But the thing about non-duality is like the practice of non-duality, like through like self-inquiry or whatever, is the continuous process of going meta, which like I see a lot of your drawings is just like a continuous process of something reflecting on itself into infinity. I think that's actually a really good way of capturing non-dualities, because once you said, oh, I'm just a verb now, oh, I'm not in duality, I'm not a noun, I'm moving all the time, like from moment to moment. Franking is a noun, Franking, but then by the time you pinpoint that as a concept or use language to describe that, that's not non-duality anymore. Then you gotta detach again, and then you keep detaching until one day or a glimpse where you just like language just stop working on your mind. You do so much inquiry, just one day, boom, you just have like experience of non-duality without any programs of the mind. So that's what those practices are for. Just keep detaching, and find out its opposite, and then go as deep as you can with it, and then detach again and again and again. That's why the process is always unfolding. It's always moment to moment, which leads me back to impermanence. At the end of the day, it's just arising and passing and impermanence. So everything could be boiled down to those words.
It's all waves.
Yeah.
It's all waves, baby.
But then you're like, oh, everything's
best music is wavy.
Yeah. But then you're like, oh, everything's impermanent. Everything's impermanent. And that becomes another ideology that you have to keep like going back and going meta with. Yeah. So that's the process of breaking duality from non-duality is that kind of, and I think a lot of your work like depicts that pretty well. And like I remember one of my first videos that I did at like Art Center, like actually was already implying that concept even before I knew anything about non-duality. How like things going on the screen and I detach it and detach it. At the end, it loops back into the beginning, which is another way of depicting the truth that non-duality. Another word for non-duality is a strange loop. Like reality is a strange loop. Everything is a reflection of everything else. So like a mirror, you put two mirrors against each other, and you see this infinite number of like layers that you zoom out, and just nothing. So that's a really good example of like something that's like a strange loop. So the human beings are just strange loops. Computers are strange loops. The only reason why anything comes to existence at all is through this continuous process of reflecting off of each other like a loop. And the biggest loop, of course, is God. Like the whole universe is a loop, which is why I like to use the word God masturbating to itself until the whole universe is created. So we all just gods like masturbating to itself, with different fractals masturbating to itself. But fundamentally, there's only one substance. There's only one BBC that's masturbating. But then inside that big BBC, there's fractals of BBC that's constantly masturbating. Even if you fuck somebody, that's still like you're just still fucking image of yourself. So everything arises through this process of like going meta and like infinite loop.
And the reason why I think this strange infinite loop is the fundamental default process that gives rise to everything in the universe is because we talked about the blank screen before. Like if the blank screen is infinite and it's absolute, then by its own very nature, it's by default, it would include itself. And if it includes itself, then it must somehow know itself through itself. And that's why I think the fundamental property of this blank screen, this white piece of canvas, this nothingness, has one intrinsic property, and that is self-awareness. If it include itself at infinite, then by its very own nature, it is self-aware. So if I can just pinpoint one universal law or process or property of the whole universe, then it is somehow self-aware.
You should make a drawing on that, like God like fab into itself. Actually, you already kind of do it.
Yeah. Oh, it's like, what am I thinking? I was thinking earlier when we were talking about, the sort of like the Platonic idea of the world of forms, almost like a way to try to preserve the noun. It's like noticing that everything is a temporary pattern, but there was this sort of desire to sort of, if there's this pattern that we call Milesing, right, that is defined by something, maybe my genome or but not, it's way more complicated than that. Like it's defined by everything that contributed to my brain existing the way it does in this moment. It's almost like it's that sort of continuous aspect of human thought where we're looking for the essence, we're looking for the nouns. Like people have wanted to find the nouns, because that's like the sort of Platonic idea is that every chair is an imperfect reflection of the sort of perfect chair.
Right.
But that feels to me like maybe, isn't the sort of fundamental breakthrough in Buddhism, it came out of thousands of years of contemplative practice where people were trying to look for the sort of Atman, the essential self, and the sort of big realization of Buddhism is that there is no thing to be found. It's all just interconnected emptiness or infinity or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, but I think your philosophy of just God jerking off to himself fractally is pretty. It's funnier. It's so incredibly hard to talk about.
Yeah.
Because, like you said, you're really like using language for something it's not capable of doing. Like we're trying to point to something that kind of has to be directly apprehended.
Right. Okay, and then the thing I want to talk about is like emptiness. A lot of people like think emptiness is like this void or this like really bleak image of like, oh, nothing's happening. Like I don't want to be empty. People
Like
always
ultimate nihilism or something.
Yeah, then I'm just like emptiness doesn't mean that it's bleak or that it's devoid of content or devoid of feelings. Emptiness, like there's so much misleading terms and concepts that get thrown into emptiness. The way I like to describe emptiness is metaphorically, if an animal could represent emptiness, it would be like a chameleon or like an octopus. You know how they're always changing colors. They're always like adapting to their environment. They're always very fluid. And so, or another metaphor is like those DMT like tunnel animation or like the Google Deep image where you see a face, but then you see all those like different like the face like morphs and like it goes into itself, or like the DMT trip where it's just like it almost looks like everything. It looks like the different colors changing all the time, like those abstract like patterns, like always like fractals that are always going in and out of each other. That to me, just looking at it visually, if I ask somebody who doesn't know anything about emptiness or like infinity, they'll be like, that's not empty. That's completely full. That's completely infinite. And I think that's what emptiness is. And the relationship between emptiness and form is something that a lot of people don't understand either, because like they're saying, okay, there's a form over there, there's a chair over there, so all the air is emptiness. Is that how it is? And the answer is no, because like emptiness is form and form is emptiness. So even that chair that I'm looking at right now, let's say this bottle right here, this is emptiness right here. This is form manifested by emptiness. So emptiness is all around you, but it's manifested and transformed into different forms. But the form itself is still emptiness, even though it's a different shape. But the essence of it is still emptiness. So if everything is emptiness, then you don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to like access like the deepest like psychedelic state or the deepest like samadhi to see emptiness. You kind of do. You have to have that experience first, and then come back to the duality and be like, holy shit, I just experienced emptiness, and everything is emptiness. Right here, this is emptiness. Like the space between my hands is emptiness. Yeah, that's obvious. But the emptiness that's in between my hand right now is the same energy, it's the same substance that's giving rise to my body. You can't really appreciate that until you realize that, well, yeah, physics does say that, the atoms, you probe really deep down into the atoms, it's just strings and vibrations. But like that's just conceptual understanding. But like when you do a lot of Vipassana, you can actually experience that. That's why I call my body a hologram, because like the way I experience my body is just like emptiness, like moment to moment manifestation itself into like my hand, my fingers, my eyes. But it's the same source, it's the same substance. It doesn't matter whether like this object is harder than my face. Oh, this must be has more form, and this is less form. This is more empty. No, it's all the same emptiness, manifested in slightly different configurations. And certain kind of configurations appear to be harder than others, but that's just your perceptual, like your brain perceiving different emptiness as being quote unquote hard and quote unquote soft, and that's another condition of the brain, another like category of the mind that's making those distinctions.
it's just a crazy, sounded like vacuum cleaning.
That's emptiness right there, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why like monks.
I,
That's why monks who sometimes meditate in like really loud environments, and then it doesn't affect them because they don't look at it as like noise of like, oh, this is solidity. This is like this noise is hitting my like my ear. This is hardness. This is form. This is materialistic form. But if you realize emptiness, any kind of situation, any loud noises or like construction sites is just the manifestation of emptiness. It's just like the light that's like flickering on the screen. And no matter how like violent the drama or the people in the drama are inflicting on each other, it's just emptiness dancing. And that's another way of looking at compassion too. Just like, yeah, there's no like such thing as a hardcore like asshole. There's no like, oh, soft Buddha. They're just like, oh, I'm emptiness, I'm soft. They're just the same thing.
one way I've often thought about it is that if you're looking for something that's fundamentally true about consciousness, it must be true in all moments. Because if you're looking for something that is like to consciousness, it can't. You can notice must just be another. It's more light on the screen. You know, if you use the metaphor of the screen and the movie playing, you know, your experience from moment to moment is a movie of sights, sounds, tastes, smells, feelings in your body, thoughts. But anything that you can notice, anything that arises, can't be what you are. That must just be another sort of temporary phenomena. So, like, I often think that my idea of intellectually of what emptiness would be is the sort of the fact that consciousness has room for anything to manifest. Like, it can be anything.
It could be anything.
Anything you're noticing is just an impermanent form, so it can't be what you are.
But you are also it, though. You are also part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it can't be just what you are, but you are a part of it too. Because like if everything's made out of the same substance, if it's absolutely true, then everything that we talked about before, like the ego, like non-enlightenment, or like the flesh, that's all still part of like ultimate truth. Because absolutely includes everything. So like when you going back to what you said about the constant, what is fundamentally true? That to really boggle it down to the most simplest terms, what's absolutely true is your direct experience right now is consciousness. Because everything you look at, even you look at a chair right over there, you're like, oh, my consciousness is here. That's the chair. That's reflecting in my brain. That's already separation, right? So if it's true, then it's true all the time. What is true? What is true all the time for everybody, including like Hitler or like a baby or like me and like you, is the fact that you're conscious from the moment that you were born until now. Like that substance, that invisible substance that thoughts are sort of reflected on. It doesn't matter how many thoughts you have. It doesn't matter who is having those thoughts. The fact is, like, every one of us, from the moment that we were born until now, there's nothing but consciousness, and reality is nothing but consciousness. So at the end of the day, you tie in non-duality with God, with consciousness, with reality, with the absolute, with the infinity, and they're just all talking about the same thing. Just that one single substance that's permanent, and that you can get that experientially.
How strange it is. How did this happen? When did this begin happening? It's like duration is another
hold on a second.
Kind of qualia. It's another duration is just another subjective quality, right? Like it's sort of like. It gives me there's something very strange about this sort of when did we get here? When did this conscious experience start? Like it feels like any sense of how much time has passed or how long it's been. These are all just thoughts arising in the moment. There's a kind of timeless infinity to the present moment. Like there is
present moment is eternity, because in the present moment, the past and the future are still within the present moment. So that's why all those like spiritual teachers talk so much about the now, but most people who read about like the power of now, they're just like, okay, let's stay in the present, let's not forget about the past. But there's a lot deeper connotation there. Like when you're truly in the now, future, that's outside of time and space, because like past and the future are the mind's construct of like duration.
Yeah.
So once you're in the now, there's no duration. So that's why there's a consciousness outside of time and space, is what they mean. And even if I'm
There's this book by a physicist called Our Mathematical Universe that's like surprisingly has a lot of really interesting depth to it, where he's talking about using the language of someone who has studied and trained in, theoretical physics, but he comes to a kind of almost like a dual conclusion, which is that he says it's a book on sort of the multiverse, and he thinks of mathematics as being the best. Like in some sense, like he uses this mathematics, like we would talk about patterns, that everything, like when you look for the stuff, when you chase it down to the smallest level, you only ever come up with sort of eventually you come to sort of behavior of information. That's what sort of our current and he sort of his ultimate statement about reality is he just says all mathematical objects really exist, and he would call like a universe with a history a kind of exotic mathematical objects, and like he and subjectivity is what information feels like to be processed, and
that's the same way of talking about consciousness manifests its form into like humans and thoughts, and how like information basically is conscious ones and zeros, and within those ones and zeros you have different forms of it. Yeah.
I was going to say the thing that he says that is so interesting is the perception of time flowing it's just another qualia like redness of red. It's just another like in the present moment. It's another kind of quality to subjective experience. The sense that time is moving in a direction is just it's actually just a quality of a present moment. State.
Yeah. So it's not like in the past, it's moving from the past to the future. It's everything happening right now. And then when you look at it,
there's a kind of static view.
Static.
In time versus is a mathematical object that might. He talked about something. He said, "Is process real? Is there such thing as process, or is there a broad enough perspective where these are just sort of hyperdimensional objects, that flow from state to state, and what looks like a process, cause and effect, is just a kind of perspective. It's a kind of three-dimensional perspective where you experience this kind of bigger object slice by slice, and the reason we experience it that way is, in the same way, the specific way we see visible light, is selected for because the wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum that penetrate seawater, which is where the first eyes evolved. So the only reason the visible light is the wavelengths it is just defined by a sort of, again, evolutionary constraints. And even our perception of time unfolding is just like that. It's another kind of specific survival tool. And a broad absolute perspective could see, the whole multiverse as a kind of static infinity, just... Yeah, like you said, all mathematically definable objects really exist, and it really got me thinking about painting, because painting feels so much like a process. Like it feels like there's this kind of like every painting is different, but there's this kind of, there's a moment of when an idea first comes to the surface that you notice, and there's a sketching process, and then, sometimes when I'm working on a painting, you really feel like you're making decisions, or sometimes a thought will arise triggered by a conversation you hear through the wall of two people walking by, and that thought chain makes you realize something. Or often for me it's like lyrics in a song, or an emotional moment in a song, or something interesting in a talk will trigger some sort of chain of events that leads me to change a painting in a radically different direction, and I'm left feeling like, if I hadn't put this specific song on, or if I hadn't come into the studio this morning and had come in 10 minutes later, the painting I end up with is totally different. So like creating something is this interesting way to kind of watch a process unfold, and I just thought it was very interesting to sort of wonder if is there really a process, or is this painting just kind of... Do you get what I'm trying to come at? Like it's just like
kind of. I was thinking about other analogies when I was hearing that, but let's see if my analogy makes sense to you. The construction of film, Like the way when you watch it, obviously it's like floating through your consciousness. But then the film itself, it's static. If you look at the film strip, or just imagine how, like in my timeline, when I put together all the little clips, when you see it from a really broad perspective, it's something static. It's like a painting. But then once a film starts rolling, it becomes like something in duration in space. And another analogy is photography, actually. That's kind of like the reverse analogy. When you take a picture, the picture is static, but the only way you can recognize the value or the narrative or feel something about this one static image is the infinite frame of things that you excluded. So in a sense, that's kind of like the opposite of that. It's like you see a static photo, but then in your mind, or you're actually not seeing the static photo. You're seeing everything, like infinite number of frames that you cut off to get to that one frame, and that one frame inversely becomes something that isn't static. Becomes something that's moving. So the two are relative, but like you can look at it from both ways, you know. I don't know if
That's a really interesting way of putting it, that a painting is as much about everything it isn't a painting of. like that's a kind of a photograph, but I feel like it's the same with a painting. Like there's a kind of
yeah,
that would be the sort of, I guess you only recognize what it is because it isn't everything else at the same time.
Yeah. So the painting is kind of like, okay, your paintings are static, even though a lot of
that is the blank white canvas. That's pure light. That's like an exposure of everything.
Right, right. I mean? The blank space is like the consciousness.
I've had experiences of like non-dual experiences when rendering in pencil, because it's a kind of, you start from a drawing of pure light, and by drawing you draw the light. You reveal form, and you reveal what the image is by you have to create a sense of light. You have to draw everything that isn't the light.
Right.
And there's a sort of really interesting process by which you're sort of you're going from infinite possibility, and you're narrowing it down to a sort of more specific form.
Yeah. So the blank slate, like, or the consciousness, is the blank slate of paper is the absolute, and then you extract from that. You put limitation of the mind onto that blank piece of paper to create a form.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then that's why I said in the beginning you have to do both, because if it's just a piece of paper you show people, they're not going to have any understanding of what we're talking about. But if we put the form in and then detract it again and be like, the reason why this form even exists is because it's manifested from this blank light, and you can apply that to anything in the universe. It's like, that's why God says in the beginning of this light, and that's why a lot of like spiritual teachers use light, enlightenment. You know, they use light as sort of this source, metaphorical source that is quote unquote God. It's like and the substance, the most non-dual substance is light, I guess, you know. And then I guess that's one Einstein, like when he was like 16, his only thought experiment for years was, how do you like get fast enough to chase after light, which is the constant in the universe. Then he can't. You can't ever chase. And
by being constant, light has no sense of duration.
Yeah.
Like if you could assume the subjectivity of a photon, it's everywhere it's ever going to be simultaneously, because like time collapses to having no duration when you're moving at the speed of light.
Right.
If anyone studies physics, check if I think I'm right about that. I don't think I'm like doing Deepak Chopra quantum woo there.
You're approaching from a more scientific point, which I understand, like from the theory of relativity, like light is the constant, but then space and time are relative to each other in accordance to that constant. So if you're standing still, like me, if I'm a car and I'm just standing still, I occupy no space, but relative to time, I'm occupying a lot of time. But if I start moving faster and faster, I'm starting to occupy a lot more space and a lot less time. That's why if you go really fast, almost to the speed of light, you sort of become you get stretched. Either you get stretched, you become static, or both. I don't know. So like the energy of the time going to space and vice versa, they're relative to each other in accordance to the constant, which is light. So that constant, which is light, is the emptiness that manifests the correlation and the process of space and time, you know.
often felt like when I'm teaching people still life, when you're like at the school when I teach still lives, you kind of you put some objects on. It's this fun game of like putting an object on a surface, and then just applying. It's like a sort of applied visual mindfulness thing. You're sort of like learning to get behind your thoughts about what, and then to actually recreate how it's arising in the present moment as you look at it. And then sometimes I've had this thought when you're looking at an object there, and we're studying light, how light falls across form, and it is from the Big Bang, this just kind of expansion of pure energy. It's time, it's kind of expanded, and the clouds have formed stars, and stars have had rings of matter form planets around them, and then on a planet, this whole process has unfolded to form some sort of. If you're drawing a marble sculpture, like for that sculpture to be there, it's like had to be crafted by someone who was eating and feeding of plants and animals that came from the sunlight. You can follow the chain of cause and effect of this kind of object. Even the light coming out of the light bulb is powered by a grid that runs on oil, which was creatures that were running off of sun, transforming sunlight millions of years ago. And there's just kind of it's all just sort of light that is unfolded, and then here you are sort of trying to learn. There's something so beautiful about life drawing, because it's this kind of process of you realize how much boredom is just a quality of inattention. Like if you do something that sounds like it should be really boring, like just stare at an apple. The longer you apply your attention to it, you realize there's just unbelievable complexity that you will find like innately interesting if you can hold your attention on it. And that's why I always tell people to start with life drawing. Like now, I always used to hear that when I was starting drawing, and I always thought it was kind of
a lot of people try to go too abstract.
I really feel like just because drawing from life is like just learning to tap in to
reality, the direct experience of reality, and then from that you can extract.
And a direct connection, like learning that every moment of your life that you are conscious, you can just pay attention to anything. You can get so much better at drawing by just like anywhere you're sat. Like if you're on a bus, just look at something and try to figure out why it looks the way it does. Where is the light coming from? Is it diffuse? Is it coming through clouds? Is it bouncing off of a window? Is it being, and just like analyze the light and shadow effects and just try to figure out why do they look the way they do. And then I think that's how you become really good at drawing from imagination, is that you can be practicing even when you're not drawing. You just literally anything you're looking at, any material, what is it about this material that makes it more reflective or more matte, more dull? Why are the shadow shapes the way they are? Why are certain edges joining together and others really clear? And like just becoming like learning that it's really empowering to people that there's no special place in the world where like there's more potential for life drawing. It's like you can be anywhere, and if you just look, like you could just draw your boring radiator in a dungeon basement, and it's still light and form, and it's still there for you to sort of like learn from. So I think it's really empowering for practice. Very simple tools, just a pencil and paper, and just learning to sort of.
Yeah, and the thing about boredom, I have a comment to make about that like sort of correlate to like meditation practice. It's like when you go to the retreat, the first 3 or 4 days, you're just filled with boredom. And a lot of people go to like only 3-day retreats and then they just leave, but you never get anything out of it if it's just 3 days. You have to pass a certain layers of your mind that you have to like strip away the layers that you identify as boredom, which is why in the beginning it's so bored. You want to be able to like strip all that away to be able to get to the core of the fruit. So it's like peeling an orange, and the peeling of the orange is boring, but then without that frontier, that's almost like a defense mechanism of like universal cosmic insight. You have to sit there for 3 days and peel away all those things that you identify as boredom, or just sit there and be bored, and then you flip to the other side. That's where all the interesting things come from. So like when you say like drawing like really boring stuff, that's a good practice to like peeling that orange and then get to the sweet and the fruit and the nutrients of it. So boredom is actually
because when with life drawings, it was like look again, just look a little closer, look for longer,
Yeah.
and it's never boring. You can't, like, there are like, there's always something.
There's
You know
always
what I mean?
something.
There's
Yeah.
always, yeah.
That's why Sam Harris talks about.
Even if you set up something that is ultimately boring, like it truly has like low contrast or it's kind of difficult to make out. Like one of the things about life drawing that people do wrong is like let's say when people are standing in a circle around the model doing a drawing, you're normally like a few meters away, and people always have trouble with hands and faces because these are areas of the body that are like
Most
totally
interesting.
wrapped. They're like wrapped in layers and layers of thought. Like you have all these kind of, like when someone looks at the back of an elbow or has studied anatomy, they kind of don't really have much idea about what's going on there, so they kind of copy it a bit more directly. But then they get to the hand and they're like, oh, this is my pinky finger, this is my ring finger,
This is
my
my
middle
face.
finger, my index finger, my thumb. Yeah, this is my face, this is my nose, my nostrils, I know about the boundaries of the lips. And so if you look at a kid's drawing of a face, they do like, you know, a lemon, some eyelashes and some dots, because what they're drawing is like representations of different divisions they've been taught in language. You know, this
Right.
represents, I know there are eyelids, I know there are eyelashes. And then adults normally have a kind of more sophisticated model of that, still just drawing the symbols. So people do stuff like if one side of the model's face is in shadow and you're kind of like, you know, you're stood far away, it's very hard to like make out anything. But they're saying to themselves, but it's the eye there. So they like, you see people straining so hard to see the eye and then trying to draw it in, and you end up with these kind of looking drawings. And so much of like teaching life is just telling people, look, it's everything you need to copy is right there on the surface.
Right.
If it's vague, draw it specifically vague in exactly the way it's vague. I mean, like a really high level drawing will have like the same kind, like if it's hard to see the eye but there's a dark smudge there, you recreate that vagueness specifically. So it's like something that you get in meditation, which is that like, yeah, a lot of the deeper insights of meditation are actually not deeper, they're right there on the surface. But
Those are the
you
most
need to sort
interesting
of
ones.
train
Yeah.
It's like training your attention to recognize things that are actually, they're right there. You know, the selflessness of consciousness is right there
yeah.
on the surface.
Yeah.
It's just hard to see it if you haven't trained your attention to notice specifically the way things are. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, totally. Because like when you do Vipassana, when you scan your body up and down from like the tip of your head to like you try to cover every like cubic centimeter until you like your toes. Sometimes people get stuck or they couldn't get into the state because they're too focused on, oh, I'm scanning my head right now. This is my shoulder. They have this mental body map that isn't even there. That's an illusion. But then when you really get into the state, you realize your whole body is just a cloud of sensations. And once you can bypass the conceptual like categories of face, eyes, mouth, then realize that the whole body is just clouds of sensations moving, morphing moment by moment. The whole body is a hologram. Then it dissolves, and then you can really get to the interesting stuff. Like, okay, how everything is a hologram. You once the line between, if the line between your eyes and your nose is dissolved, what's the next? The dissolution between the boundary of your presupposed body and the world, and that's another duality destroyed. And then, okay, self and others. You start meditating on your relationship between you and the world and other people, and you realize that once you start breaking apart and deconstructing those boundaries,
dissolving boundaries.
Yeah, dissolving boundaries, and that's why you get to the source.
That's a classic thing. Like if you're listening right now, like look at your experience, right? Like if you look around, you don't see your own head. You might see a smudge of your nose. You might see your hands and feet.
That's conceptual.
And
yeah.
Right now, if you look at your hand and then you notice the rest of your visual field, and you'll notice a lot of objects that aren't, in air quotes, you.
Right.
What a lot of people don't realize is that the boundary of labeling this sight hand and then the thing behind it, other, is just a layer of thinking. And that's a classic experience of boundarylessness that people get psychedelics, is that you'll be like maybe, outside in nature, and the part of the brain telling you where your body is and where the rest of the world begins is momentarily like just totally dissolved. Like the default mode network is what they call it if you're doing the scientific lens. That's kind of like the scientific word for the ego. And a lot of people have this experience that they'll be staring at the sky or staring at a tree, and won't feel any more ownership or lack of ownership. It's like paradoxically, you are you doing the whole universe, or is the whole universe doing you? Is the way Alan Watts would put it. Like and then you start trying to like. I understand that like sometimes I'm too often I feel like I'm the annoying person who just wants to talk about. Like in a lot of life, it can just kind of be obnoxious to sort of start ear beating people with your like thoughts on non-duality. It's almost like it's to carve out a little space where we can just ramble and risk not making sense and like just have a go.